Hello, I'm the 10-minute English teacher. Let's get you exam ready. Today, I'm going to walk you through an Inspector Calls the entire play in 101 key quotes. Before we get going, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are plenty of things on the channel to help you revise for an Inspector Calls. Okay, my guide to Inspector Calls the entire play in 101 quotes. We start with Act 1, and the first thing we have are the stage notes. We find out that we're in the dining room of a fairly large suburban house, and the lighting is pink and intimate, but it's going to change and become harder and brighter when the Inspector arrives. We've got Edna, the parlour maid, and she is replacing champagne glasses with port, a cigar box, and cigarettes. Priestley wants us to know that we've got men in tails and white ties, not dinner jackets. It's important we know that this is a wealthy family celebrating an occasion. We're told that Burling is a heavy-looking, rather pretentious man, and we know that Mrs. Burling from the stage notes is a rather cold woman. She's also her husband's social superior, and this is a family pleased with themselves. The first line of the play follows this, and we've got Mr. Burling directing Edna to serve them. He says, giving us the port, Edna, that's right. There's a bit of a conversation about the engagement of Gerald to Sheila. That is the occasion that's being celebrated, and Mrs. Burling says, when you're married, you'll soon realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. So that's what Sheila's going to look forward to, that sort of marriage. Mr. Burling says it's a pity Sir George and Lady Croft can't be with us, because he would be very pleased to be celebrating with Gerald's wealthy parents. You're just the sort of son-in-law I always wanted, says Mr. Burling. Now, he gives a speech about their engagement, but instead of talking about them, he starts talking about what their engagement might mean for him, and the idea of the Crofts and Burlings working together for lower costs and higher prices is what he says. There's a bit of teasing at this point between Sheila and Gerald, and she says, you be careful or I'll start weeping, and then he's given her engagement ring, and she says, look, mummy, isn't it a beauty? Mr. Burling then drops a hint that he might be getting a knighthood. Just a knighthood, he says, downplaying it, but we know that's really important. He wants to be Sir Burling, just like Gerald's father is Sir Croft. We're then given another little speech, this time about society. Mr. Burling talks about the Titanic being unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, and hints at the idea that the future is going to be looking very bright for Gerald and Sheila, which is ironic because it's not. And then he talks about society and says we're not all mixed up together like bees in a hive community and all that nonsense. And it's at that point that the inspector arrives symbolically to silence Mr. Burling and challenge him. Mr. Burling talks about the idea that he used to be Lord Mayor and that he plays golf with Colonel Roberts, who's the chief inspector. The inspector himself says, I don't play golf. Mr. Burling actually says, perhaps I ought to warn you, before mentioning the fact that he has friends in important high places. The inspector doesn't care. He's there to ask questions about a girl who's died and talks about a chain of events. Now, Mr. Burling finds out that he has sacked this girl. Of course, he pretends he hasn't actually known who she is and doesn't recognise her from the photo. But he then calls her this girl and a wretched girl and says that she was asking for the earth. The inspector says better to ask for the earth than just take it. Sheila doesn't see the situation the same way as her father. She butts in and says these girls aren't just cheap labour, they're people. She then asks about the girl and asks, was she pretty? Because that's the sort of thing at this point that's important to her. She's then shown the photo and realises that she's involved in the story herself. She gives a half-stifled sob when she sees it, and she has an honest reaction to seeing the photo, conversely to her father. She then finds out that she's the reason the girl got sacked. She'd said, if they didn't get rid of that girl, I'd never go near the place again, and I'd persuade mother to close our accounts with them. So that's the reason that she has been a part of the girl's story. We then find out the girl has changed her name to Daisy Renton, and Gerald gives it away that he's known her. It's then his turn to speak, but before the inspector turns to Gerald, he leaves for a moment. Gerald says we can keep it from him. Sheila doesn't favour the idea of trying to keep the truth from the inspector. She says, you'll see. And it's at that point, at the end of Act 1, the inspector arrives, and it's his turn to speak to Gerald. At the beginning of Act 2, it's Gerald's turn to speak about his involvement with the girl, but before that, we've got Sheila talking about how bad she feels. She says, I know I'm to blame and I'm desperately sorry, but she also says, I won't believe it's simply my fault. So she's a little bit more reflective and understanding than the other characters at this point. Mrs. Burling arrives and she says, and she introduces herself to the inspector quite confidently. Sheila says, you see, I feel you're beginning all wrong. Mrs. Burling can't understand the change in Sheila and says to the inspector, you seem to have made a great impression on this child. We often do the young ones, the inspector says coolly. He also speaks calmly and sternly, very contradictory to the easy tone of Mrs. Burling. Mrs. Burling tries to get rid of Sheila and says, I think you ought to go to bed and forget about this absurd business. And she also mentions girls of that class. Now, at this point, the inspector is quite abrupt and firm with Mrs. Burling. And she says, that I consider is a trifle impertinent. Eric's disappeared at this point. He's gone out and we don't quite know where. She says he's only a boy, and the inspector contradicts her and says, no, he's a young man and some young men drink too much. Now, Gerald is spoken to about his involvement with the girl at this point and talks about meeting her at the Palace Bar. He says it's a favourite haunt of women of the town. The inspector is speaking harshly and sharply and with the authority. Sheila says, probably between us we killed her. And Mrs. Burling, while she's interrupting, Sheila says, you wait, mother. And we find out that the girl was desperately hard up and at that point desperately hungry. Sheila is annoyed that Gerald has betrayed her and he's had an affair with Daisy Renton. She says, you were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it. Mrs. Burling says, I don't think we want any more details of this disgusting affair, which Gerald says was inevitable. And she wants Sheila to leave, as does Mr. Burling, but Sheila hears the whole story and then gives the engagement ring back to Gerald. I think you'd better take this with you. But she also says, I rather respect you more than I ever have done before. Mr. Burling cannot imagine that engagement coming to an end. It means so much for him, and he says, now Sheila, I'm not defending him, but you must understand. Sheila then says, don't interfere, please, father. She's addressing her mother and father as mother and father to show that she's a little bit more mature and she's changed. It's that point that we want to know where Eric is, and the inspector says that he shall have to go and get him after cutting in sharply. Now, Mr. Burling speaks with the inspector a little bit and he says that I'm a public man. The inspector tells Mr. Burling public men have responsibilities as well as privileges. Mrs. Burling is spoken to. Do you recognise her? Asks the inspector. No, why should I? Is what Mrs. Burling says. And she talks about the girl calling herself Mrs. Burling, which she thinks is a piece of gross impertinence. And she also says, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. We find that the girl has been offered stolen money and was pregnant. And at this point, there's a lot of arguing between the characters and the inspector. He says, I'm losing all patience with you people. Mrs. Burling starts to blame the father, and she calls him a drunken young idler. And she says that he should be compelled to marry her and should confess in public. The inspector doesn't leave at that stage. He's not on his way to look for the father, and we realise the father is on his way back to the scene. He says he's staying there to do my duty, and Sheila says, mother, don't you see? Mr. Burling there says, you don't mean to say that my boy is mixed up in this business, and Eric returns at the end of Act 2. So we realise that he is the father and he's going to be spoken to, which takes us into Act 3. Eric has forced himself on the girl after meeting her at the Palace Bar. I was in that state where a chap easily turns nasty, is what he says. And he says that I don't even remember. That's the hellish thing. No, Eric, the hellish thing is that you've attacked her and forced yourself upon her. Although his parents don't seem that bothered by that. Eric talks about where he got the money from. He's taken that from the office at the works. Eric, you stole money, says Mrs. Burling. And Mr. Burling says, I need to cover this up as soon as I can. It's the money that's been stolen that hurts them more. They feel the victims of something, and they can't really see, even at this point, that the girl who has died and also been attacked by Eric is actually the victim in this story. Mr. Burling can't understand why Eric didn't go to him for help or advice, and Eric says, you're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. We've got Eric finding out about the fact that his child has been is no more because of the suicide of Eva Smith or Daisy Renton, and he says, you killed them both, to his mother, Mrs. Burling. You killed them both, damn you, damn you. And it's at that point the inspector says, stop. After there's arguments amongst the family, he cuts in and he talks about the idea that Eric treated her like an animal, and then starts speaking to each of the characters in the story about their involvement one by one. Mr. Burling says, look, Inspector, I'd give thousands, yes, thousands. You're offering the money at the wrong time, Mr. Burling, says the inspector. And then he gives a really wonderful speech about society and says, there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives. And if we don't learn that lesson, it will be taught in fire and blood and anguish. And then that leads on to some more arguments between the family about who is responsible and who's to blame. And we've then got Sheila strangely saying, was he really a police inspector? She also says, I'm going in a minute or two anyhow, as if she's going to leave the Burling family, but she doesn't. Mrs. Burling starts thinking about the way that she's been spoken to, and she says his manner was extraordinary, so rude and assertive. Mr. Burling also feels that couldn't have been a real police inspector simply because of the way that he was spoken to. Gerald then turns up, he's been out, and rather than thinking about himself and his relationship with the girl and how sad it is that she's died, he's actually been out to find out if the inspector was a real inspector, and he's spoken to a police constable and found out that at the station there is no Inspector Gould. We've been had, he says. He's offered the opportunity to find out the rest of the story, of what was been said between the inspector and the other characters, but he doesn't want to know. He says, that's all right, I don't want to. Eric then speaks a little bit with his parents. Mr. Burling says, hold your tongue if you want to stay here. I don't give a damn whether I stay here or not, is what Eric says. But of course he will stay there and does stay there. But he also says we all helped to kill her. Sheila is then offered the ring back. They found out the inspector isn't really a real inspector, and Mr. Burling is trying to offer drinks and take everything back to what it was before the inspector called in the first place. She says, it's too soon, I must think. So at that stage, she doesn't say no, she doesn't say yes, and she's got some choices to make. She doesn't actually conclusively make a choice in the play. Mr. Burling is at that point a little bit surprised by the fact that Eric and Sheila aren't willing to join the party and the spirit of things as he's trying to re-establish the mirth of the beginning of the play. He says the famous younger generation who think they know it all, and it's at that point that the phone rings and we realise that an inspector is on his way to speak to the rest of the family. And the last line of the play is, as they stare guiltily and dumbfounded, the curtain falls. All of them together implicated, and they're all responsible in their own ways for the death of Eva Smith. Check out the other videos on my channel. I'll continue to make content. Feel free to ask something you'd like me to cover in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share, and keep revising.